This is Jerry Barrett talking. Today's date is April 10th, 1986. I'm interviewing Robert Evans in his office at Eastern Airlines headquarters in Miami. If you would, Bob, would you just indicate what your current job is with Eastern?
Currently, I'm the manager, compensation.
Okay. And what did you do before you came here, before you came to Eastern?
Well, I've been with Eastern now for over 18 years, and prior to that, I was a college student.
Oh, okay. So out of college you came
Out of
here.
college, directly, yeah.
What other positions have you held here? Mostly in the area of compensation?
No, I've been in compensation now for about 5 years. Prior to that, it was primarily in the area of personnel planning and procedures and policy writing of a general nature.
Oh, yeah. So mostly in the employee relations area?
It's been in the what's now called a human resources organization for all of my career with Eastern, yeah.
Okay. One of the focuses of my interest is the employee relations that has occurred since the deregulation. With the understanding you may have to go back a little bit before that to talk about some of it. And I'd be particularly interested in your telling me your recollection of events connected with compensation and other things dealing with the unions.
Okay, well, Eastern has had a recent history, really, of wage concessionary programs which have really been funded by wage increases that then were withheld to a large degree, which probably, in an overall sense in the long run, may have led to the setting of overall wage levels higher than they might have been had it not been for the accompanying wage concessions that went along with them. Being that it was necessary. The first wage concession program we had was merely a deferral of, this was in 1976, a deferral of already negotiated contract increases and increases that would have been granted non-contract people for 1 year.
Okay.
It was just increases that would have become effective on January 1 of 1976 were deferred for a year.
Mm-hmm.
And became effective on January 1 of 1977, along with whatever other programs and increases would normally have occurred at that time. Out of that, the company incurred a liability in terms of either, and the employee had the choice, a profit-sharing plan that ran for the 5 following years and paid off in, I believe, 3 of those 5 years, at least partially, not fully, and warrants, which were issued to some employees who chose that option, which still are obligations that the company has, which can be converted to common shares between now, I believe, in 1987. But it's not a great deal for the employee right now because he has to put up $10 of his money to buy a share. So the share would really have to be reached $20 for him to do well with it.
Mm-hmm.
But the following year, we entered in the first 5 years of what was called a variable earnings program, and in that case, each of the 3 major bargaining units and the non-contract employees, and in fact, I believe all of the smaller union groups, the domestic smaller union groups at least, participated in the plan. The way that was kicked off was that a negotiated increase that the IAM had scheduled for October of 1977 was accelerated to July 4th of 1977 in order to for the IAM to gain the IAM's acceptance with the variable earnings program concept, and to have 3.5% of their pay withheld. As it turned out, you see that they actually got a wage increase on July 4th, which was in excess of the 3.5.
I see. And that was by contract already?
It was already negotiated, but it was accelerated.
Mm-hmm.
The non-contract people, I believe, got something on the order of a 5 or 6% increase at that time, from which their 3.5 was withheld. That wasn't, that was just an acceleration of one obligation, and probably the actual implementation of another wage increase that would have occurred anyway. Later, however, it seems that, in my humble opinion at least, that the feeling that we were able to withhold some of the increases granted made it easier to feel that the increases could be granted. And it created in the minds of the employees a feeling that that money was theirs, that they had a salary of record, as we call it, less a certain amount equal their salary paid, but that in the long run, that they had negotiated for, or they had been promised in one way or another, that salary of record full restoration, and that that was theirs, although they had never really enjoyed it at any one time. And so that might have, and I can't be sure, no one can, might have contributed to an escalation of the overall wage base that wound up higher than it might have been in the absence of any of the programs. In the final analysis, this is not to say that these were financial drains to Eastern Airlines in the interim, however. They obviously were important programs, particularly in terms of confidence of the financial institutions. And it's not to say that the whole program was, or the whole thing was a mistake at all. It's just that that one item probably, in my view, did lead to the end result that I described. The variable earnings program was unique in industry and was patterned, and other companies have followed suit. What it amounted to was that it was sort of a profit-sharing plan, whereby employees, if the company reached its profit goal, which was 2 cents on the dollar, in those years, a $60 million profit, the company would pay the employees all of that money which had been withheld. If there was any profit at all, a prorated portion of that withholding would be returned to the employees, and only in a loss year would they forfeit the entire 3.5% of their pay for the year. In the event the company exceeded its profit goal of 2%, then employees could receive a bonus, as it were, above that which they had foregone, up to a limitation of the 3.5% on top. So they could receive, in that case, 103.5% of their base pay.
Okay.
In the highest profit years. The first half year the program was in effect. It began in the middle of 1977. There was a payoff to employees because the company made a profit. It didn't reach its profit goals, but there was a payoff to the employees. That same year, this profit-sharing plan from the 1976 wage freeze that I referred to earlier paid off to employees. So the employees got money there. 1978, as my recollection serves me correctly, the company exceeded its profit goals and actually paid to employees not only the 3.5% that had been withheld, but a bonus on top of that. The following year, again, there was some profit, but it did not reach the profit goal, so there was some return to employees, but it didn't equal what they had foregone. And the following 2.5 years, there was no return to employees as a result of the program.
By then, we were into deregulation.
Deregulation, I believe we normally think of 1978 as the beginning of deregulation. So, in truth, the 76 wage freeze preceded deregulation, but was occasioned by some very serious financial difficulties the company was in 1975, and it was foresight, I guess, that these types of programs were going to be needed in a highly deregulated and highly competitive industry.
Where did the idea for the variable earnings program come from? Do you know? I'm curious about it because other companies have imitated that in some fashion or another. But Eastern's was the first, I believe.
Well, I can't say that for sure. It's the first that I ever was aware of, certainly the first in the airline industry. In 1976, the company was casting about to find out how employees felt about various ways in which they could help the company. And I don't recall all the details. There was a ballot, a straw poll, had 4 different options. It was distributed to non-contract people. Distributed to non-contract people because the feeling was then, I'm sure it still is, that to gain opinions from contract people in the same fashion, you have to deal through their leadership. And the one group that we knew that we could communicate with directly and get a good reading on the employee's real opinion was the non-contract group, and that postcard ballot was sent out. And there was another one after that, and gradually the various options that were discussed winnowed down to just this type of a plan that would put certain amount of the employee's earnings at risk to help ensure the company's profitability, but if the companies turned out to be very profitable, would in turn reward that risk-taking with a bonus.
Mm-hmm. When you say at risk, exactly how do you mean that? How do you mean at risk?
Well, what I mean is, for example, as an illustration of an employee, his base pay was $1,000 a month, just as an illustration. From the beginning of the wage to variable earnings program, the employee was paid $965 a month. That $35 was put off on the side.
Mm-hmm.
And not really. I mean, it was a bookkeeping exercise. It wasn't, the money wasn't put into a satchel anywhere.
Yes.
But if the company, in the absence of any program, he would receive $1,000 a month.
Mm-hmm.
With the program and the absence of a profit, he lost, he did not receive the benefit of that additional money. So therefore, that was what I mean at risk.
Okay.
He was at risk that in some of his earnings.
Mm-hmm.
And concurrently, if the company did very well, then he stood to gain a higher rate of pay than he would have in the absence of a program.
Okay. What was next? What happened after the variable earnings?
Well, during the 5-year span, that was a long period of time, the variable earnings program, another crisis that hit the airline industry was the PATCO strike. And the one pay program that was instituted during the PATCO strike, or in reaction to the PATCO strike, was a management pay reduction, which was related only to management above the first level supervisor category. In most cases, it was related to the salary grade, and people at second level supervision in the airport, for example, or first level supervision in the mechanics ranks, took a 6%, additional 6% pay cut, which was not keyed to any payback. It was just a cut.
Okay.
And that escalated upwards so that it was up to 10%, and I'm not sure at the officer level what it was, but I believe it was about 10%. And that lasted for about 7.5 months during the latter part of 1981 and through the end of March in 82.
And that was connected with the...
It was related to the PATCO strike. At least that's the manner in which it was communicated. The financial advantage to the company of that program was really not tremendous, because it applied only to management and only to a portion of management, and not to the heavily populated lower levels of management.
Mm-hmm.
But it was another one of the various wage reduction programs that took place. As far as the non-contract people are concerned, the variable earnings program really continued for 5.5 years. It continued through the end of 1982. The IAM and this was all developed, it's all developed subsequent to these dates because it was a subject of negotiations. Their forfeiture, I guess, of pay, or their foregoance of pay really ended in the middle of 1982, and the pay reductions that had continued to take place were assigned to what was called an investment bonus agreement fund, which has a guaranteed payback, and that for the IEM continued from the middle of 1982 through the end of 1983. So they had a year and a half of participation in that program at, again, 3.5% of their salary. There was, at one point in 83, the option for employees to participate to greater extent if they wished to. And some did, but not too many. But some did, and some did a few did in very large percentages. But by and large, it was only marginal participation. This was a guaranteed return. This was like money in the bank. It was a withholding of income, and accruing 10% interest as long as the prime rate was above 10%, with a guaranteed payback for the IM no later than the end of January 1987. So that's coming up on us. There were also provisions that it would be paid back earlier in the event of profitability, which did not transpire. The non-contract people got into the IBA in June 1 of 1983. So they were really only in the IBA program for 7 months through the end of 83. Non-contract people also on June 1 of 1983 began to participate in what was called a debenture program. Originally, when this thing went in June of 83, it was intended to last for a year and a half. It didn't turn out that way. The total pay withholding for non-contract people was, as I say, 3.5% for the IBA, 6.5% for the debenture program. The debenture, well, that would wind up in the creation of one or more $1,000 debentures, which were subordinated and convertible to common stock. They are still held by employees now. At the end of 1983, when another program was coming along, the 83 program was called to a halt, and those who had $1,000 or more, well, if they had $1,000 or more in their debenture credit account, they were issued a debenture, and the breakage, so to speak, was refunded. If it was less than $1,000, the whole thing was refunded. So for some employees who either were working part-time or participated for less than the 7 months, or in one of the lower graded jobs, they did not in effect participate in this program at all, other than the fact that they didn't receive the money on time. Mm-hmm. Others, in some cases, the more highly paid people got probably 2 debentures in that period of time. I know some who did. The IM did not participate in the debenture program. Pilots did. And I don't have as much direct recollection of all the details of the pilot program because I was a little more removed from that. But they did participate they were the biggest participators in the debenture program. And they have the greatest per capita amount in that program. All along the way, there are wage increases that are going into effect, so that we're not talking about a static wage rate from 1977 on, and these reductions, seemingly greater reductions off that base. The base is growing all the time, and the reductions are growing because the base is growing by a larger percentage than the reductions are growing.
Okay.
It's sort of difficult, but if you could chart that in a visually in a way, It's two escalating lines that are growing farther apart.
Okay, okay, yes.
In 19, there are a lot of little, like the variable earnings program was called the FEAP. And the next program that came along was the wage investment program, which was known colloquially by some as the WHIP. And some felt that's just what it did to them. But that was an 18% reduction for all employee groups. And the truth is, in that case, at first, it did actually result in a reduction in pay. When I'm talking about earlier, and I'm getting a little disjointed now, but when I'm talking about the 10% that combined in the 1983 wage investment program, the one that started in June, there was a general increase of 12% that preceded it. In the agents got a general increase of 16%, from which the 10% was withheld.
Okay.
And that's the illustration I'm describing. The IAM got a general increase of around 21%, and they continue to have a 3.5% withholding. So that when the end of that year rolled around, and there was, my recollection serves me correctly, in the non-contract area there was a 3.7. There was a merit program in the fall also for the management people, funded at 4%. So management went up no less than, on average, 16% during the year, whereas the wage investment reduction was 10%, or less than 10%, because of the overage, the breakage in the debentures were refunded. So it really was an operative percentage less than 10, as it turned out. Then a 3.7% general increase on January 1, 1984 was accompanied by an increase in the wage reduction from 10% to now 18%. And that was the 1984 wage investment program, which lasted the full year. And the employees, contract, non-contract, all the groups participated in that program at 18%. The pilots started off at 22%, and then, I don't know how they arrived at this number, but it was reduced to 19.73% sometime in March of the year, and there were trade-offs, presumably on productivity increases and things of this nature that accompanied that. It's often difficult to, especially for someone who's not involved in that on a day-to-day basis, to figure out who got the better of the deal. But presumably it was at least a swap. The employees, the entire amount that was withheld from paychecks for that entire year was then turned into, on a pro rata share, the issuance of the issuance in trust of 12 million shares of common stock and 3 million shares of subordinated 5% preferred shares, cumulative subordinated. And as I say, it was on a prorated basis, so the more money that was in effect withheld from a person's salary, the greater his issuance of common stock in trust for him. The common stock is just what it is. It is Eastern common stock that is being held in trust. The pilots have had an opportunity to acquire theirs. Other groups have not as yet, but as I understand it, beginning in this summer sometime, there will be a graduated ability, a limited and gradual ability for employees who wish to draw down their common stock, which is being held in trust for them. It's not obviously going to allow a run on the market to have it all withdrawn at any one time. There are limitations on how rapidly it can be withdrawn. And a person will also have an option, as I understand it, to assign it, to leave it in the fund and assign it to a 401k retirement plan or something of this nature. have an option to purchase more, and various options that are being developed now and aren't finalized as to what people can do with their common stock that is now held in trust for them. One of the most attractive options probably will be the conversion of the stock into a 401k plan, because of the continued advantage of deferring tax on not only on the receipt of the stock, but also on any type of future appreciation on it.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess there we've gotten the at the end of 1984, in the negotiations that led to the 1984 wage investment program, there were agreements with union negotiators that they would meet with the company in December of 1984 and agree upon whatever measures were necessary to ensure the continued viability of the company. Words to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't happen, or it didn't happen in good faith at any rate. So there are one of the continuing saga of squabbles and vitriolic confrontations. And in the January of 1985 or 85, the unions held that the program was over. In 1985, indeed, there was what we call a full restoration. People were paid the full 100% salary of record in January 1 of 1985, but then it went into another type of gradual restoration, at least for the IAM and the non-contract people, presumably based upon productivity gains. Productivity gains that could be measured and quantified would yield partial restorations, so to speak, of this 18% that had been withheld. And I won't go into detail with all of the percentages and how they were arrived at and when they occurred, but that gradually led to, at the conclusion of 1985, to agreements for full restoration of the original salaries of record. And in subsequent to that, there have been successful negotiations with the pilots and the flight attendants, and an imposition on the non-contract employees of wage reductions on the order of 20% in terms of real productivity. It is slightly in excess of 20% in the pilot and flight attendant areas, as I understand it, because the wages were cut 20%, but the amount of hours needed to earn those wages were increased, so that on an hour-for-hour basis it really was, in terms of the company's advantage, it yields greater than a 20% savings in unit wage costs. As the current situation exists, the IAM still has not, the term we use is come to the party. People I talk to, both in rank and file and in the union leadership, believe it's a matter of time, not if, but when. Mm-hmm. And we're all waiting. See what will happen.
During these various programs, were you involved at all in the negotiations, or kind of in the back room to take your pencil and calculate what the results would be?
Let me be very blunt as to my role in that. It was more scribe and administrator than much of anything else.
Ah.
To be quite candid.
Okay.
No, I was not involved in the actual negotiation process, and I think it must be said that most of the planning and most of the decision-making in these programs were done at levels much higher than mine in the organization.
Okay. The reason I ask it that way is that when Mr. Usry and I were preparing a list of people who, potential interviewees,
mm-hmm.
Frank Borman said to be sure and involve I've lost his first name now, Amos,
Mm-hmm.
was left
Mhm.
the company, now
Mhm.
retired. And when Bill Osprey talked to him on the phone, we've not
Mhm.
interviewed him yet,
Mhm.
he listed just a couple of people that we should be sure and interview.
Mhm.
Amos did,
Mhm.
and you were on that list as
Mhm.
someone that definitely must be interviewed. So that suggested to me that he thought you knew the inner workings of at least a portion of all of this.
Well, I guess I've demonstrated I know what happened, and the sequence in which it happened. Actually, how the actually I was involved in various type planning meetings, but I must say in all candor that the final programs, I learned what the final programs were, and perhaps earlier than most people, but I certainly didn't create them.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Wish I had.
Yeah. Do you say that because they could have been improved? At least from an
No,
administrative
no,
point of view,
I
or-
just would have enjoyed perhaps being more involved in this process
Mhm.
than I really was, and I think it would have been more interesting.
Mhm. Okay. Okay. When you look at the sum and substance of it, for an outsider, it's very difficult to get your mind around each one of which was going on in which years, where you had overlapping programs, some affecting all employees, some affecting others. From a person involved in compensation, is it that complicated?
It's enormously complicated, and I guess really I'm glad you're a very able individual and intelligent, because otherwise we'd probably have had this interview in a rubber room, because by now you'd be bouncing off it with all of these anachronisms and the various, and we just briefly touched upon it because they're very complicated, and each of the groups was different. The entry, of course, you've got to wrap up one item before you go on to another.
Mm-hmm.
So the negotiations, for example, in the variable earnings program, the non-contract people were polled as to their willingness to participate, and that willingness was known late in 1976. For the officers of the company, and I believe the directors, that plan went into effect on January 1 of 1977. Then there were negotiations next with the pilots, and they came on board. They agreed with a Me Too clause, only if the others do. Flight attendants were next, and the IAM was last, and they agreed to come on, and as I say, in mid 1977. So each of the processes were different, culminating at different times. The final result was the same, that in terms of everybody participating, all the major groups participating in the same variable earnings program with the same ground rules. Then there was a question of tying up all the small union groups. And some of those small union groups didn't get tied up until the end of the year. So in effect, for them, their 5-year plan had a different 5-year sequence than the major groups. Because none of these plans have ever been applicable to the international locations. By this, I mean outside of the United States, Canada, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands, Bermuda, Bahamas, the Caribbean and Latin American countries, and so on, because of the, number one, the small numbers of people there, number two, the differences in laws and protective labor legislation, which is there, which in some cases says you just can't cut wages, even if people will let you. And, of course, in many cases, we're talking about the issuance of negotiable instruments in which the Securities Exchange Commission had to be involved in the United States, and, of course, that presumably they have their counterparts in each of these other countries, so the overall effort involved and the return just has not been worth it to extend it to those. Where their contribution has occurred is that on a conscious effort, we review pay programs in foreign locations which are not unionized, and of course we negotiate in foreign locations where there are unionized employees, and we have many of those. And in the negotiation process, there's an attempt to slow down the growth. In the programs that we plan for the non-contract people, we will slow it down or delay the implementation so that they have not escaped scot-free, so to speak. Their salary growth has been diminished and delayed, but not to the same extent as it would appear that the domestic people have.
You indicated earlier that that throughout all this period, there still were traditional contract negotiations going on.
Yes, indeed.
Which resulted in one or more year contracts for
Mm-hmm.
each of the major, the three major unions. And in most cases, those provided for some kind of increase in compensation.
In all cases.
In all cases?
Mhm.
Do you have any data that would illustrate that point, that starting with 76 up to 86, that 10-year period, that a pilot is better off in terms of total income?
We have done an analysis of that, yes, that tracks on an index basis the average pay or pay and benefits in some cases, of the various employee groups over that span of time, and this is purely recollection. The flight attendant group fared the best of all in a percentage basis. They're starting from perhaps a lower base and felt they had more to make up for than some of the others. That was something on the order of about 150% growth, like 50% growth over that index.
Okay.
And management was something like 99.2.
A net loss for them then, really, in management.
That's what those numbers indicate, yes.
Yes.
And this is, we chose, I believe the numbers I'm citing now, and as I say, I can't be sure of these from memory. I can do some checking at the conclusion of this and provide you better information.
Okay.
I believe we're going from we're choosing a good time to demonstrate this.
Okay.
In short, I believe it was the end of '81, not the whole period of time. But the numbers, we have done those exercises partly in support of labor negotiation activities, but also just because it's it's good information to have and demonstrate, and gives us information that's valuable in planning. But overall there have been considerable salary growth during this period of time, and what this doesn't include, what we are using is general programs. Like for contract employees, it's a general increase. For non-contract people, we have combination general increase, and we have merit programs. So a merit program, the percentage we would use in calculating this would be what it's funded for. Well, some people got more and some people got less, and so on. What none of this takes into consideration on an individual basis are the automatic progression increases. So an individual would, in any type of a salary range where there were service increases, would get these in addition to the others.
Yes.
The reason they're discarded in our calculation is because if you assume that you have attrition, then you're going to have lower paid people replacing the higher paid people, which will cancel out the effect of this progression increase on the group,
Okay.
but not on the individual.
Yes. Okay. I follow that.
Follow that?
Yes.
You sure?
Yes.
Good.
Now you're going to ask me to explain it to you.
No, I'm not going to. I've heard it enough.
The Eastern, did Eastern ever propose and successfully negotiate any kind of two-tier arrangement with any of its employees?
Oh yeah, we have now, with the non-contract people, the agents and the clerical people, we have had what's called a two-tier pay structure since January 1 of 1984. We also negotiated with the flight attendants a two-tier pay agreement, which became effective January 1 of 1984. The mechanics and related have had a two-tier pay structure since April of 1985, and the pilots have just negotiated one. It's in effect, it began in effect for them very recently, sometime, I think it's in the first part of March. And those continue in existence. The irony of the flight attendant two-tier wage scale is that it really, in all honesty, it was poorly designed. The two-tier wage scale, the B scales that they come out of the negotiations with were really deep and applied over the full 13 years of the progression. And between the time negotiations ceased and the thing went out for ratification, there were some changes made in response to, I believe, appeals of the Union Negotiating Committee that they just weren't going to sell it. It wasn't going to go to it wasn't going to pass ratification in that form. So it was modified in a way that brought the B scale flight attendants to parity with the A scale flight attendants at the beginning of the 5th year, and excluded them from participation in wage reduction programs.
Oh.
In short, that led to a situation where in the 3rd year, the B scale flight attendant was making more than the A scale flight attendant.
And that exists? I mean, that's the way it would work now?
Yes. Well, they negotiated away that. 4th year would be even worse, and had it been, and no one intended, I'm sure, it to be a permanent, ongoing document forever, so not subject to future negotiation, it would have meant that the B scale people forever would make more than the A scale people, and obviously that was not an intended result.
Mm-hmm.
So, in this most recent negotiation, they really did away with the old B scale. So all the folks that came on from 1984 through the ratification date that were on the B scale were moved over into the A scale, and a new B scale started, which is a good B scale.
Okay.
It does not merge, and the same wage reduction rules apply to them as to the others. So it's the type of B scale that, hindsight is wonderful, of course, that would have been preferable from the very beginning, and we would have been able to retain that cost advantage. Now, again, in all fairness to labor relations and all, the advantage that the old B scale was intended to gain for us gradually would have disappeared anyway as parity was reached in the 4th year.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that was a loss forever. We would have lost that advantage anyway in time.
Mm-hmm.
And the new B scale is one that does not lose that advantage, so it was well conceived.
With the other employees, including the non-contract, is there a design in the system that they ultimately will merge?
They ultimately do merge. The non-contract merges agents. I think it's after 11 years. Clerical after 9 years at maximum. The way it's designed now, and it's subject to change. It has certain automatic progression increase amounts and certain merit increase provisions.
Mm-hmm.
And that, when I say 11 years, it is dependent upon the company properly funding merit programs in accordance with the design of the program for people to reach max in 11 years, and if that funding is not there, then it's going to take longer.
Yes, okay.
And conversely, if we're overly generous, which hasn't been our habit, then one could reach in a shorter distance, or if one is remarkably meritorious, one could reach maximum in a shorter period of time.
The merit increases apply only to non-contract people.
Yes.
Okay. That
Yeah.
there's not provided for with the
No.
with the contract people.
Right.
Let me pause here and turn this over.
Okay.
Okay, we're back on. When I was changing the tape, I was just admitting how complicated this is, and you had some comments on how complicated it is. Can you repeat some of that?
Well, I guess what I said was that, yes, I agreed wholeheartedly that it was extremely complicated. Each and every one of the plans had a certain complexity to it, and superimposed one on top of the other, particularly as with differences in some cases between contract and non-contract groups and the timing. It would really take sort of a mural chart that would begin from 1976 and sort of plot various increases, decreases, give-backs, and all throughout the end on an index-type basis to find out where people would wind up in the long run. And that would not even be able to, in a way, I don't think I can't see right now how I could chart it on a plane, the various equity instruments or stocks, debentures, warrants, and things of this nature, which some people feel are worth money and some people feel aren't, and the value in people's minds of those things changes as time progresses also. So how that would fit into our mural, I'm not sure.
One of the problems that occurs to me is that communicating this to an individual employee, how does this affect me, making the amount I know I take home now? And certainly with some of these programs that are stretched out over 5 years and overlap other programs, that must have been an extremely difficult problem to get that across.
Yes, it was. We've done, in some cases I think we did a reasonably good job. In some cases we left things to be desired and caught up when questions were asked, but I can provide you, I believe, with a couple of the better communications. In one case I can recall it was a 4-page fold-out with done in a colorful fashion that asks in a question and answer format that really did answer most of the questions.
Mm-hmm.
Now, most of these programs, whenever there was an equity instrument at stake, at least, and in some cases, other times, there were prospecti that were developed for SEC eventual and stockholder approval,
Mm-hmm.
eventually, which explained the whole thing in typical legalese. So that made it probably more difficult to understand than if it had been communicated in English, but I understand the legal necessity for that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's been a lot of communication, very complicated subjects. Probably overall not a bad job of explaining to employees what it all amounts to, but memories are short, and it's easy to be, even someone like myself who's involved in this, to forget what the provisions of this plan were and when it's supposed to pay off and so on.
It tends to merge in with others that you have in your head as well.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
And I suppose from the point of view of the need that the corporation had to build up a level of trust with its employees, because as you said, in some of these programs that you were really asking the employee to put something at risk.
Mm-hmm.
It makes it more difficult when what you're trying to explain is extremely complicated.
Mm-hmm.
The trust building is all the more difficult under those kind of circumstances.
Yeah, the initial, well, they got progressively more complicated because the first program, as I said, 1976, was merely, here's what you were going to get and you're not going to get it.
Yep.
But you will, and this fixed date in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And in the interim, a fairly simple formula of, if we meet our profit goals, then you'll get paid.
Mm-hmm.
And they got gradually a little more complicated. The VEP was something like that, but when we got into debentures, and particularly into the issuance of common stock, and more particularly into the issuance of preferred stock, which has a payoff subordinated to dividends on other preferred stock with certain limitations, and is eventually only at the decision of the trustees convertible to common stock. It's a very nebulous thing, particularly since the employee has never seen it.
Mm-hmm.
He's never had that in his hand because it's in trust. We get a piece of paper periodically that shows how many we have, and that's all we've seen of it so far.
Yes.
So I don't doubt that it's there, and no one doubts that it's there, but it is somewhat removed.
Yes. I think your word nebulous is a good description of it. It really is hard to feel, in the sense of putting your hand on it as you can with a paycheck, other things like that. You made reference to some things happen as a result of productivity changes. Can you talk a little bit about that, and how measurable was any of that?
On the record?
Yes, if you can.
Well, absolute good faith efforts were made to measure all of the productivity increases. But in any case like that, where there are two different views, there's bound to be, in some cases, compromise as to what actually was a productivity increase. And differences of opinion were expressed by, like, pilots union, for example, wanted to and were given the opportunity to review with the financial people how the IAM productivity increases were calculated and how the non-contract increases were calculated. So nothing was done that was not subject to scrutiny. But it's extremely, extremely difficult to quantify, particularly anticipated savings. This is something we've done, and by the end of the year, it's going to save us this much money. Therefore, include that in your formula, which will lead to the restoration of a portion of a percent of pay.
Yes, I can appreciate what you're saying. It's relatively simple, I would suspect, if employees are paid a certain amount and they're going to actually work more hours for the same pay.
Work more hours, produce more widgets.
Yes.
Anything that's purely quantifiable.
Yes.
In terms of one of the items that was counted as productivity improvement, which led to wage restoration for both the IAM and the non-contract people, were the B scales.
Oh, yes, okay.
Now, this calculation of how much that's going to yield you depends upon an analysis of history and an anticipation of the future. The history may not foretell the future, and your anticipations may not come to pass.
What you're dealing with there is turnover, for example?
Yes.
How
right.
much new hiring
Right.
will be?
How many people you would anticipate you will hire based upon what you've been doing and what your present plan is in terms of hours of flying and so on between now and the span here.
But you superimpose on that
And working into it historical attrition and so on.
Okay.
And then comparing the rate that you would otherwise have paid in the absence of a B scale with the B scale rate.
But given the market conditions that have prevailed for the last 5 or 6 years, it's very hard to have your historic experience be much of a guide.
Yes, it is. And if through some wise marketing or planning decision, the company has moved into a city that takes off like gangbusters, and we have to therefore hire many, many more new people in that city than we had originally anticipated. I'm not sure if that necessarily is something that the employees or the union had any role in in order to share in the wages,
Yes.
wage savings of it.
Yes.
And conversely,
If something were to decline.
right, if it were to decline, then the credit would have already been decided upon and not realized.
In the, I believe it was in the fall of '83, there were some auditors brought in to look at the books, in effect. Am I right about that date, fall '83?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, okay, you're right, that's right. And periodically since. I believe that was the first instance in which the books were open to the unions.
Now, when this happened, did they get into looking at the way in which compensation is calculated? And did you have auditors in here, in other words, kind of looking over your shoulder?
No.
Did not?
No. I believe it was purely, from the auditor's point of view, it was a review of the accounting practices and the profit planning cycle, and not whether business decisions were made prudently or not. Although I'm sure that would have been extremely well received by some of the union leaders at the time to take their shot at that. But they did anyway, without invitation, so whatever.
Yeah. Would it have been better? I'm inviting you really not to be a sort of a Monday morning quarterback here. There were so many wage programs, all of which were intended in some way to reduce the total wage bill. In fact, would it have been better if there had been a big one at the beginning and only one, and carried through from 1976?
If one had hindsight and one could convince those that needed convincing of the necessity of such a program, sure, it would have been lovely. But it probably isn't a realistic thing to have hoped for, because in many cases, you've got to see the fire leaping around the door to the house before you're going to run out the back door.
It's human nature, isn't it, really?
Surely, and political nature too. I mean, in all due respect, the union leader can't say, okay, I see this image and I agree with what you're talking about, and I'll just go sell it, because the others are not going to have the same vision. And he's in the final analysis, he's a politician. Pure and simple.
Yes. And he has to count the votes, and he'll come up short.
Absolutely.
Trying to sell something that is that difficult to sell. That question is sort of prompted by the thought that what you have now is what appears like kind of a patch quilt effect.
Well, historically, yes. What we have now is the best, because we don't have these two records, two salaries. We don't have a salary record, a salary paid. What we've done now is more or less, to some degree, what you were alluding to. It is a quote-unquote, nothing's permanent wage reduction, where there is just one salary level, and people are not aspiring, or we hope they're not aspiring to this higher level, which is held out there.
Yes.
The duality of these two pay rates were both a problem to the company and to the union leadership, because the outs, there's always outs and ins in any union, or in some cases there's several outs parties. They made, they would periodically or regularly bring this difference to the attention of the people representing them, who were in power at the time. When are you going to get this back for me? Like they ever had it.
Yes.
They never had it, but they wanted it back.
Yes, yes.
And so it gradually came to everybody's attention that the duality, the dual pay concept for the same individual was something to be gotten rid of as fast as possible. During all this time where we had the dual pay levels, benefit levels were based on the higher rate.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay.
The life insurance, company provided life insurance, pension credits, and so on. And this was most beneficial to the higher paid people who have the better pension plan, namely the pilots. So to say, to get them to go to a single pay rate, which is really the lower of these two, was quite an accomplishment.
Mm-hmm. Just from a bookkeeping point of view, it must be must have simplified things considerably to have a single rate for each classification.
It has simplified things, and we're beginning to become accustomed to it after 7, 8 years of dealing with the dual concept. It had become manageable for those of us who do it all the time. Even though we knew we weren't talking about real dollars when we were talking about paying an employee $3,000 a month. That was his salary record. We knew it wasn't $3,000 a month because he wasn't getting paid that. Maybe he would if things went well. But, so yes, it was a bit of a fantasy land.
The just remind me now that actually went out then with respect to all three of the major unions in this year, the early part of this year.
Right.
The negotiations that ended in February.
Yeah, well, the IAM, it went out for the IAM too, because the IAM is that they have one rate of pay now, except it's much higher than it should be.
Okay. And of course, what you were saying before about the two, at the very beginning of our conversation today, talking about these two, you didn't refer to it as dual rates then, but that was the expectation you were talking about that was built in.
Yes, okay, and yeah, being so close to it, yeah. The expectation of the employees was that this higher rate of pay, the salary of record, was something to which you promised me that I'm entitled to that. When am I going to get it?
Yeah.
And when it was not a real expenditure to the company at that point in time, it's easier to agree to that rate. Which
Yes.
then when the note comes due, then it's a different story.
Yes.
So that's why, and it's just a perception on my part. I couldn't prove it,
Yes.
that eventual rate is higher than it would have been if we'd just been totally talking about reduction in wage levels or restraint in wage increases or something of this nature on a one level basis.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been most interesting. I'm gonna stop now because I've taken more of your time than I thought I would, and I'd like to have the opportunity to get back with you. But before I do that, I'll give you a copy of the transcript so you can kind of look at
Sure.
what you said, and
Sure.
then we can talk further.
Mhm.
Okay. So with that, I want to thank you for your
Okay.
time. Appreciate it very much.
It's been interesting to me too.
Good.